on to probably one of the more interesting ways that we learn, particularly for human beings. Now, obviously, this is a type of learning that other animals can do, especially primates. But I'd argue that since human beings are such social creatures, that observational learning and other types of learning by watching other people is probably the biggest way that we learn about the world as children and as adults. And it's also the way we learn how to exist in this world the way it is, how we learn about it. So, how on earth do we learn by watching others? And in general, there are three main ways. We're not really going to talk about these much in your book, but the first is observational learning. This is when learning occurs after at least one exposure to that particular behavior. The second is modeling, and this is through imitation, through observational learning. So, for example, maybe when you were a kid, you watched your mom put on things like makeup and stuff like that. And then later on, you got into her makeup and tried to do the exact same thing that she did, but with disastrous results. Usually, when you're 5, that's what happens when you play around with makeup. And then finally, vicarious conditioning or vicarious learning. This is when you learn through other people's experiences. You watch what they do, you see what happens as a result of their behavior, and you're smart enough to realize that could happen to me. I'm not even going to try that. So, for somebody like me, growing up when I was a kid and I had a very boring childhood, I actually learned a lot about what to do and what not to do by watching my younger sister mess up and make a lot of mistakes. And odds are pretty good if you have a sibling, you probably engaged in a bit of vicarious learning yourself, or maybe you served as an opportunity for vicarious learning for one of your siblings, like I did. Now, it's been suggested that we may potentially be hardwired to imitate other people. And this comes from research on what are known as mirror neurons, which are largely contained in the frontal lobe, but really they can be found in a few other areas around the brain. These are neurons that are designed to fire when we perform certain actions, as well as whenever we watch others perform those same actions. So the discovery of mirror neurons was a little bit of an accident. Mm, It's been really good. This is the first one I've had in a long time. It's a treat. Um, the first discovery of mirror neurons occurred when researchers were looking at how motor neurons in the frontal lobe, how neurons in the frontal lobe around the motor cortex fired when monkeys would watch engaged in certain types of actions. And so these researchers had a recording unit on these cells, so they knew when the cells were firing and when they weren't. And they were interested whenever these would fire when the monkey was engaged in certain actions. And then one day, one researcher kind of walks in licking an ice cream cone, and the researchers discover that these same neurons that were involved in these motor movements are now also firing vigorously when they watch somebody else move. And so it's been suggested that these mirror neurons exist as a form of mental simulation. So when we watch people do something, we start kind of simulating it in our mind as well so that we can also learn how to do the exact same action. Now, there are some other people who believe that mirror neurons also give us a sense of empathy. I think that's a little bit of an iffier claim. I'd need a little bit more evidence to feel 100% sure about that myself. So, probably the best known study of observational learning is Albert Bandura's research with the Bobo doll. And so, if you're not clear what a Bobo doll is, it's kind of a big inflatable clown that usually has a little bit of sand or water or a great deal of mass in the bottom. So when you hit it, it goes down, but then it pops back up. So it's kind of like a kickboxing bag or a sandbag where you hit it and it pops back up so that you can hit it again. And to tell you a little bit about this experiment, Researchers in the 1960s, and Bandura in particular, brought these kids in, and these children watched an adult hit a Bobo doll. And they would kick it, they'd grab a toy hammer, and they would try to hit it. And the kids just watched what happened at first. And then, depending on the condition that these children were in, they either watched an adult get punished for it, they watched an adult get rewarded for beating up the Bobo doll, or they saw nothing really happen. And so, what we tend to find is that in general, kids tended to imitate what they saw. This was especially true for conditions where the adult got rewarded for it, and also in those neutral conditions. Now, what's kind of interesting is that in the punishment condition, the children didn't really imitate what they saw. And that could potentially beg the question, did they actually learn anything? Or the fact that they were punished kind of inhibit that learning from taking place. And it turns out that no, it didn't inhibit learning. When these children that saw an adult get punished for beating up the Bobo doll were put in appropriate conditions, they beat up the Bobo doll as well. So watching somebody else get punished just prevents performance of behavior. It doesn't necessarily prevent learning. And in particular, researchers also found that these children were likely to imitate, in particular, when the adult matched their gender. So girls were more likely to beat up the Bobo doll if they saw a woman beating up the doll. Boys were more likely to beat up the doll if they saw a man beat up the doll. And so what's kind of interesting is that Bandura's research kind of highlights that aggressive behaviors can absolutely be modeled for us. And that's especially true when you're a child. You don't really fully understand what's going on in front of you. You're not able to use critical thinking. You usually can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. But modeling sends a really powerful cue that this is how the world works, even if you don't necessarily have the full adult capacity to understand. And children are going to model what they see. Why it's really cute when we hear little kids curse, but then you wonder, well, where did they learn how to do that from? So Bandura's research shows that antisocial models, whether that's happening in your family or in your neighborhood or what you see on TV, have really antisocial effects. If you are constantly, especially here in the United States, we see a lot of violent content. It teaches people that violence is how we actually solve problems. And violence is not always the best way to solve a problem. But what's really good is that pro-social models can provide opportunities for us to be better than we are. So if we see other people who are wanting to help and do good things, those are going to rub off on us in a really good way. So we do know that exposure to violent media leads to an increase in expressed aggression. Now, prior to this particular study by Gentile and colleagues, most of the data was correlational. And remember what we learned about correlation at the very beginning of the semester. Just because things are associated with each other doesn't necessarily imply that one causes the other. Maybe violent people just like to watch violent TV. But it turns out that, yes, this can occasionally have some causal effects. Things have a way of rubbing off on us without our being aware of it. And so it's really important to check in with your media diet, or else you'll come away with some potentially interesting and possibly damaging ideas on how to live your life or how you feel about yourself. Okay, so we do know that viewing media violence leads to increased expressions of aggression. So we need to make sure that we have really good models out there. Now, there are a couple of things that I didn't have time to cover. Please, please, please read about these in your book, about how biological predispositions can affect learning, as well as how cognitive predispositions can affect learning. I'm happy to talk about those very briefly at the beginning of class on Wednesday, but I do kind of want you to do the legwork on this one yourself. But I'm going to talk a little bit about memory next, to kind of get you excited and get you started. And we'll see if I can give you a little bit of a false memory. So see you then.